right, cool. I'll assume I know how to work this thing. What an awesome talk, by the way. Thank you so much, Dominic. That was like such a great talk for the first one. But I am Nicholas Fett from Tellor, and today I was gonna like show you guys Tellor, but I figured you guys all already know about oracles and how they work, especially from the last talk. So I'm just gonna kind of talk a little bit today about, okay, so what is Tellor and kind of how our view on oracles has evolved, say, over the years. Okay, so for just a brief history of Tellor, for those that don't know it, before I was actually doing Tellor, so back in 2017, I started Decentralized Derivatives Association. We got an Ethereum Foundation grant, and we were trying to do derivatives on a side chain back then. And as probably every single one of you here knows, whenever you're doing derivatives, you run pretty much headfirst into the oracle problem. And this was like in 2017, and back then, I think he had talked a little bit about it, but the only thing available was basically like Oracleize. It was like, you know, I think Thomas might actually be here, but it was like, you know, Thomas was like running a server, and it would ping you back the result for 50 cents, and it was honestly awesome, but obviously not decentralized, as a lot of us know. So we came up with an idea, okay, well, how do we come up with an oracle on our own? How do we create a decentralized oracle? And it sort of dove us into this whole rabbit hole. And so then we launched Tellor in 2019. And we've been kind of rocking it ever since. But what was kind of like, so in, say, 2018, when we're building Tellor, like, what do we want an oracle for? The big thing, so like, obviously, we were doing derivatives, and we were like, okay, so it looks like we need price feeds and we need to be on Ethereum. Like, basically there are no other chains then that are worth going to. No, you know, we don't even have price feeds. Like, God forbid we think about anything else. And then, you know, so we were building Tellor just basically for just price feeds. And we were originally building Tellor as a DAO. So we were big proponents of, we loved Maker at the time. And part of it, you know, I'm gonna kind of touch on this as we go along, but there's this idea of having like upgradability and where the governance is owned in your protocol. So, you know, whenever you're using an oracle, so if you're trying to make some decentralized protocol and you need to pick some address that's your oracle. Let's say, you know, like I think there's like basically two methods for upgradability. So if that oracle wants to upgrade itself and change some code, it can either have upgradability in its contract, which has a whole problem and mess around it, or it can basically just fork, and then it has a new address which screws over every single contract using that oracle. You know, like the example would be like Uniswap. So Uniswap had Uniswap v2, and if you were using Uniswap v2 as an oracle, and then all the liquidity migrated over to Uniswap v3, you would either have to provide all of the liquidity yourself on that v2 contract, or you would have to own the governance of updating it, which means you would have to do that. Back in 2018, we sort of saw, we liked the idea of being a DAO. We could sort of handle that upgradability ourselves. So that's kind of where we came from. I put, you know, we were focusing on like maybe if we just usage will equal price growth, and then the last one, the big assumption we had originally was that people wanted security over speed. So, you know, based on that top assumption, everybody's building on Ethereum. You know, we all know of the the scalability trilemma. So, you know, there's decentralization, security, and speed, and there's trade-offs. So if you're building on Ethereum, you obviously don't care about speed as much as you do security. And that was an assumption that we made. Looking at kind of what's changed. So now fast forward to 2022, what are we looking at? The big thing, obviously, there's more than just Ethereum out there. You know, even Ethereum says that there's more than just Ethereum out there, and it's gonna be a multi-chain future, so you need to be able to go on all of these different chains and be able to provide Oracle services on all of these chains. It's a whole lot different. And then as far as just kind of what type of data is needed, a big piece going forward. Obviously, there's price feeds on all of these chains you're going to need to do, but then also just cross-chain communication is going to be really, really big. Whether it's creating these cross-chain dexes, these bridging protocols, all those things they're basically just oracles, and it's just different kinds of data. So, you can use Dominic's framework for analyzing bridges or for analyzing any of these cross-chain communication tools too. It's all exactly the same thing. It's just that ground layer is a little bit different. The other thing that sort of changed is, originally we had wanted to sort of own the governance process, and we've since moved away from that. Like probably a lot of protocols, we've had a hard time getting community to actually vote on things and really own a lot of those pieces. So we're moving more in the route of, say, like, this is a set in stone protocol, and then if we upgrade the contract, it's going to go to a new address. The way that we're sort of thinking about it is, similar to like the Uniswap example, where you would have to provide liquidity all on your own on that V2 contract. How can you just basically keep people on the old contract in a cheap fashion that doesn't necessitate moving forward? So that's something. It's more of this like opt-in model. So Bitcoiners might really like that. Less soft forks. Other things, obviously, one of the biggest things that basically the Oracle space is still, and kind of the whole crypto space is surrounded by, it's just like, there's just this constant price talk, whether it has to do with the Oracle tokens and things like that. And there's basically zero connection between like usage and price in the Oracle space, and probably in crypto in general. But it's something that we've sort of realized, and then also just how that affects your community and how that affects basically getting users and everything. It's pretty wild. And the last piece, originally, as Dominic I talked about earlier, originally we were actually proof of work on our Oracle, and we've since moved to just an explicit staking model. And part of this reason was to change from giving people options for speed or security. So in the same way, whenever you deposit something on Coinbase, you actually can't spend it right away. So if you deposit your Ethereum on Coinbase, like, usually you have to wait for X number of block confirmations. And this is where you're choosing speed versus security, or, well, I guess Coinbase is choosing it for you. But if you want something really, really fast, it's going to be less secure. And in the same way with the Tellor Oracle, we've tried to build something where, we have a dispute period or a dispute phase that, if you want something really, really fast, it's probably going to be less secure, and since less people are checking it. So that's just something we're thinking about, but how we can sort of make that as flexible as possible is really what we're trying to design. Now just kind of backing off and looking at like, okay, so what's the space of oracles look like right now in general? Like obviously assuming no Tellor, because we're building something great. What sort of doesn't exist, and what, hopefully we can all just sort of talk about honestly and try and build, or what I would love to see us all build. I think the big thing is just generic oracles on any chain. We talk to tons of projects, and they come to us. A lot of times it's just like layer ones themselves. They're like, hey, can you be an oracle on our chain? Or, or a project, hey, we're launching on this chain, can you come provide oracle data on that chain? And like, it's actually backwards from how it should be. Like, in a true decentralized world, you should just be able to go launch the oracle on that chain. Like, you shouldn't have to, if you're gonna launch a smart contract on Ethereum, you don't go ask for permission or ask if Ethereum can do it. You just sort of do it. In the same way, like, kind of that third point, like any type of data or no authorization for data, everybody still comes to us like in our Discord, and they're like, hey, can you provide this kind of data for us? Can you put this price feed on? And that's still like really backwards, that you would even think that you have to come to some centralized entity to request data. And that's what I'm hoping that we can sort of flip on its head. Like, let's make it like, we all assume now, like most layer ones, like we deployed on Optimism, like, never talk to the Optimism team. Like, you just sort of go do it, and you assume that you can go do it, and of course you can, and that's the way that we're trying to build an oracle. Obviously, the second point, like, we're still missing kind of that decentralized oracles. I'd say we're sort of in that space of, like for L1s, and where there was like Ethereum, and then there was like a bunch of DPoS models. I'll disagree with Dominic, like the reputation-based models, as far as that being similar to staking. Not necessarily. We can do better as a decentralized space, like for sure. And the last thing, like, you really I know Dominic in his last presentation was talking about like the big thing that we have to think about with oracles. A lot of times people really focus on like, well, can bad data get on chain? But the bigger problem for most of these projects is like, what about liveness of data? If the oracle basically, if all of those nodes, even if they don't lie, if they just get disputed or they decide to shut off their machines, what happens to your project? And like, how do you sort of have liveness of data, and how do you have those guarantees? And thinking about that is something that's still sort of pretty early in the oracle space, I would say. So, like I just put here, like, what does the ideal oracle look like? Something simple, back to thinking like, okay, what does the ideal DEX look like? If you were to ask people in 2018, like, what does the ideal DEX look like? And you had like Ether Delta, which was like just everything was an on-chain order book. You would assume that it would be like okay, well maybe if in 2018 everyone would have thought like, oh, it's going to have all these crazy features and be able to do every single order possible, and it would look like FTX completely on chain. And in reality, like, what's one? It's like Uniswap, basically, like the simplest thing possible, because that's sort of just what works in a decentralized way. It's just things that are really minimal, and then you don't have to think about how they work. So I think we're still trying to figure out what does that look like for an oracle, and I know there's some roundtables here on how we can talk about standardization and making it sort of look more like that. All right. So what is Tellor doing? This is just where talk a little bit about what we're up to. So we're kind of really honing down on becoming a primitive. So how do you sort of make it where this looks like something that anybody can run themselves, anybody can launch on any chain, there's no approvals. Obviously, we're taking out upgradability, most of the governance. We still have a token out there, because probably the biggest piece that we're working on right now is the governance around voting on disputes and how that happens. It's sort of a governance problem in general in the space, which isn't something that we're here to solve at an Oracle conference, but it's something that we should just kind of, it's really hard to take apart like DAO governance and oracles in general, just because at some point there is some subjectivity, because obviously if there was no subjectivity, then it would be just part of the L1 basically. So there's always going to be some subjectivity, but where that gets owned and how you deal with it is basically the oracle problem in general. So, all right, no idea how long I have. Oh, 5 minutes, okay, thank you. So we'll have some time for questions, but for my last slide, just kind of like why decentralization matters. So if you guys want to talk, so I actually used to work as a regulator as well. So before I did the decentralized derivatives, I worked at the CFTC. And if you guys saw, there was the Polymarket case recently. So Polymarket is a prediction market, and they got in trouble with the CFTC for being a prediction market, and they needed to go register. And part of, in that case, they said, well, since Polymarket resolved their own markets, which means that Polymarket was acting as their own oracle, which the CFTC stated as one of the reasons that they need to go register. Okay, so which for all of you oracle providers out there should beg the question, okay, well, if Polymarket is in trouble and needs to register for being their own oracle, if they give the oracle job to you, do you need to go register? That's like, I presented it, I made a nice slide presentation and presented it to the people I used to work with at CFTC, and they were like, well, you're asking the right questions. And I was like, thanks. So they don't know either. It's still an open question, but regulation's kind of coming. And if there's sort of centralized oracle providers that are doing things, it's going to be really hard. So another project I'm working on just a little bit is it's basically like you can do like a cross-chain mixer. So where you have like deposits on one chain and withdrawals on the other, and you pass like zero knowledge proofs back and forth, and you can use it for privacy, and it's super cool. The problem is like, obviously that's a mixer and is probably illegal in the US. So is the oracle also illegal for passing this data. I don't think a centralized oracle would touch it with a 10-foot pole, but it's just something you have to think about, like when you're creating these generic oracles. And the next piece, obviously talking to Dominic about the reputation base, like if you're an oracle, like reputation based are super hard because eventually, Goldman Sachs is going to come in here and be an oracle, or like, you're going to have like a LIBOR model where it's like the top 12 banks are going to be an oracle. You're not going to compete with those reputations. Like if you have like the Bank of England or, the US Bureau of Labor Statistics posting inflation data on chain, like that's the reputation that people are going to use. And, not to mention like they sell out their reputations all the time. Like, they do really evil things, and like yet they still continue. Like even in our own space, like whenever a chain does something bad, it's not like they completely go away. Like a lot of times, there's so many projects that have been hacked numerous times, and yet they're still in the billions of dollars of market cap. So don't really rely on reputation because it doesn't act quite like a stake. So. Anyway, thank you all for listening. Hopefully you guys learned a little bit more about Tellor.